Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Derek, and today we're going to be doing a lab that looks at setting up and creating a Lambda function and triggering it, and in this case, we're going to write to a DynamoDB table. So in our hypothetical scenario here, what we could have is we could have some end user over the internet that uploads data to your website, and that data is taken in by a Lambda function. And then that Lambda function will automatically write that data if it needs to do any like kind of computations on it first, or any kind of filtering or whatever. It'll take that data, it'll operate on it, and then it'll upload it to your DynamoDB table. So it's very handy if you want to kind of capture real-time uploads of data in this particular fashion. But the whole point here is to just illustrate that Lambda is a very useful serverless computing tool that can be used for a variety of tasks. We're just going to be looking at DynamoDB today, though. So let's open up the console here. And then what we're going to do first is we're going to create the DynamoDB table that is going to actually kind of hold our data, so to speak. So we're going to go to the DynamoDB console, click Create Table, and then our table name, we're just going to call it Test Table. Should be fine. And then a partition key is again going to be kind of like the primary key if you were thinking of like SQL-based databases. So similar there, but it is required. So we'll just say ID there. We'll just leave it as a string, totally fine. But you could change the data type here if you wanted to. And then for our table settings, we'll just leave this as the default. But of course, if you had a real scenario, you could increase your read or write capacity units to have better performance across your table. And then of course you could add tags to help manage your table and the associated costs. Okay, so let's just go ahead and click Create Table. That should be good for us. So it says it's creating, and it should only take like a minute or two, or a second or two. It looks like it's already ready. But what we're going to need to do now is we need to give Lambda permissions to write to this table. So they can take that user data. Okay, looks like our table's done. But so it can take that user data and then upload it to our DynamoDB table. So to do that, we're going to go to IAM. And we're going to do something here for just kind of the sake of simplicity that, in a real environment you may not do. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a role that will attach to, or that Lambda will inherit rather. And then that role will allow it to write to our DynamoDB table. So we're going to go in here, we're going to go to create role. And we're going to say AWS service is the trusted entity that we're after here to attach this role to, and it's Lambda right there. This is a common use case, as you can see here. So we'll select that and then click Next. All right, so now this is where it gets a little weird. So if you were to look at Amazon DynamoDB Full Access, that's what we are going to use today. However, if you click the plus here to expand this policy, you can kind of see the actions that it allows you to inherit. But it has kind of some elevated permissions for CloudWatch, like delete alarms, describe alarms, put metric alarm, and then for SNS as well. So it's kind of same thing: create and delete topics, subscribe, unsubscribe. So it's got some slightly elevated permissions for those two. So again, in a real environment, maybe you wouldn't want to use this DynamoDB full access policy. Maybe you'd want to get a little more granular. But again, that kind of depends on your business use case and maybe what kind of like compliance and security kind of rules and regulations you got in place. But for this lab, this totally works for me and us. It'll just speed things up here. So we'll just go ahead and select that we want to use this policy, and then we'll click Next. And role name, let's just call this write to Dynamo. And the description, so we can just kind of leave that as it is. Maybe we'll just say and write the DynamoDB table, or tables rather. Of course, you could have a more descriptive description. But what this is saying now is that, okay, it's got this statement where it's going to allow you to assume this role using STS, right? So Secure Token Service. And the principal who's going to be assuming this role is going to be the Lambda service, right? So that kind of links to the Lambda service there. And then it just kind of reviews and says, hey, here's the permissions you're going to add. And then again, if you wanted to use tags, you could totally do that. But we don't need any of those, so we'll go ahead and click Create Role. It should only take a second or two. And which it did. And so now you can see down here we have our new role. And the trusted entity is going to be an AWS service, and it's going to be Lambda. Okay. So we'll just keep this in mind that this is the role we want to use. But now what we're going to do is we're going to set up our breadwinner here of this whole lab, right? The Lambda function. The reason we're all here. And once we come into Lambda here, what we're going to do is we're going to go up to create function. And on this page, you kind of, as it kind of hints at, you create your function and you can configure it how you want. You can use blueprints, which, you know, are like if you have a specific function in mind with a specific programming language, you could see them over here, that you could do that. So you could have a template for making an HTTPS request, or, you know, throwing a custom error, whatever you want. So this is definitely helpful for future reference for sure. Or you could use a container image if you have any of those, but I don't have any of those. So we're going to go with author from scratch. Function name, we'll just call this write to DynamoDB, or just Dynamo table, so we don't have too many caps there back to back. And then runtime, I'm going to be using Python, so we'll just use the latest version. Architecture, we can leave that how it is. But we do want to expand, change default execution role here, because if we just were to leave it as it is, it's going to create a new role with just basic Lambda permissions. But we need, you know, we kind of have a use case here. We need to write to a DynamoDB table, so we need to kind of change which role that we're using so we're able to do that. So we're going to say use an existing role, and we're going to hit the drop down, and then we can see we have that write to Dynamo role that we created. So we're going to select it, and now whenever you know, this function runs, it's going to use that role, so that should give it enough permissions to write to our table. And then there's a few more advanced settings. If you needed any of those, go for it, but we don't need any of those, so I'm just going to leave those alone. I'm going to hit create function. And now it's going to bring us into kind of our function console. And if we scroll down, we go into the code source page, or section rather. What I'm going to do real quick is on another screen, I have this code snippet here. I'm just going to copy it over. Alright, so if you want, you can just pause me right now and then just kind of type this in over what was there. And then just resume me once you're done copying it, alright? So, real quick, let's just talk about what this function is actually going to do. So, just kind of stepping through it here, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to import Boto3, which is the AWS SDK for Python. And we're going to set a variable called DynamoDB by referencing this Boto3 SDK. The resource within it we're going to be looking for is going to be DynamoDB. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable called table. We're going to set it equal to DynamoDB, so it's going to reference DynamoDB from up here. And then it's going to go look at the tables in DynamoDB, and it's going to look for that table that we created that we called test table. And if you called it something else, be sure to change, you know, the name here to whatever your actual table name is. And so now down here, this is going to be the actual kind of Lambda piece. So it's going to be called Lambda handler. And then it takes two parameters here, event and context. which would be applicable if you had maybe a more dynamic Lambda function that was handling like user input or other kind of input from another source, maybe another service. But what this function is going to do for us in this case is it's going to take this table that we are getting up here, so it's going to be our test table, and then it's going to put an item into it. And that item is just going to be a simple object. It's going to use that partition key of ID that we set up, right? Because remember, it's got to kind of fall in line with that partition key. We need semi-structured data for DynamoDB. And we're just going to kind of hard code this and say it's going to be called myUniqueID1, okay? So what we should see is we should see this written to our DynamoDB table. And when this finishes with no errors, we're just going to return a message here saying, all right, data is written to DynamoDB table. And if we see that, then we should be able to assume that everything is kind of working as expected. So, excuse me. Jeez, let me grab some water after that one. So, it's kind of weird how Lambda is, let's call it structured, I guess, but the deploy is going to be kind of like the save button. So let's go ahead and just click deploy here. So you'll see up here it was saying updating the function, successfully updated the function, so our function's good to go. And so now what we need to do over here is we need to create or configure a test event rather, so we can kind of run this. So we're going to click test, and the first time you go to test your new function, you're going to get prompted with this. And we're just going to create a new event because it's our first time. So let's just call it test event. And then we just want it to be private because it's just us using it, right? We're the event creator. We don't really need a template. But it wants us to do something down here with this event JSON, and we don't really need this because this is only applicable if your function code source requires some kind of input, and ours doesn't because it just has this kind of hard-coded value right here of ID, myUniqueID1, so we don't really need this. So what we can do is we can just delete this and just have it, just kind of an empty bracket there, which should be totally fine. And then let's just go ahead and save. Okay, so test event was successfully saved. So now when we click test, it'll test it, it'll open up a new tab, and you can see over here our status was exceeded. Shows you how much memory used and the time it took to run, which these two are going to contribute to what you pay for using Lambda, by the way. And we got that response that we were looking for with a successful input, data written to DynamoDB table, and with no errors, so it looks good. But we don't just want to assume that this worked, right? We actually want to, go and see that it worked and it's acting as expected. So what we can do is we can open up DynamoDB, and we'll just navigate back to that table. So let's open that in a new tab. So I'm going to go on the left here, you'll go to tables, you'll go to explore items. So I'm going to go to explore items, and here's our table, test table. I'm going to select that. And you can see that it consumed half a RCU, a read capacity unit, because it had to read this hard-coded value that we did indeed put into our table. So we created that Lambda function to kind of go back into here real quick. We created a Lambda function here that took input from the user, which in this case is just us triggering it, and then it wrote that input data into our DynamoDB table over here. So pretty neat. And then of course this could be automated, accepting actual input from users over the internet. But we have our data here, and to again kind of further verify this, if we come back here to our Lambda function, let's close this tab. Let's change this value to, just a jargon of numbers. So it's obviously not 1 anymore. Let's hit deploy. And we get the same thing. So, that's from the old one. That was weird. So we hit deploy. You saw up there that it's saved. Now we'll hit test. All right, there we go. So now data written to table succeeded. You can see it took just a little bit longer because it had to write, a larger value, right? But if we come back here to our table and then we hit refresh, you can see that there's our new value, right? So we were able to update our Lambda function, and then it just automatically updated the data in this table by sending it on over to DynamoDB. All right, so that's how you create and trigger a Lambda function. In this case, that Lambda function then writes to a DynamoDB table, but the possibilities are endless with what Lambda can do. It's a really cool service. But let's go ahead and do some cleanup here so we're not paying for anything that we don't want. So I'm just going to select our table here. I'm going to go to delete. I'm going to type confirm that we do want to delete it. And then this should be checked. Just make sure it is. Delete all CloudWatch alarms so you're not storing any alarms or any logs. So you can see our table's gone. Okay, that's good. Since we have Lambda open, let's just go ahead and delete this function here. So functions, select it, actions, delete it, type delete. All right, and that looks good. Okay, so that's gone. And then finally, let's just clean up so we don't have, roles laying around that someone could potentially use. Let's go back into IAM. Let's go to roles. Let's go to our right to DynamoDB one that has full access to DynamoDB for Lambda. And then we're just going to hit delete. And then again, it just wants us to type to confirm. Right to Dynamo, delete, boom. And it should be gone. And there it goes. Perfect. All right, so now we've cleaned up so we're not paying anything. And that's going to conclude this lab. So hopefully it's helpful. Lambda, like I said, is a very versatile function that you're definitely going to be asked about on the test. So get familiar with kind of what it is and how it works. All right. So thanks for sticking around. We'll see you in the next lab.